This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
Yesterday, one of our sister shows here on KVNT in Alaska, Lars Larson out of the great state of Oregon, interviewed Jonathan Butcher, who's a Will Skillman Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy. So talking about teachers, classrooms, test scores. Jonathan is with the Heritage Foundation. He's the author of Splintered. This is awesome, Jonathan, that you could join us. I reached out to Jonathan and his team yesterday because I told him I was smitten by his content and how he dialogued with Lars. How long have you been in the niche of education policy?
Well, I've been researching this for 20 years now and have had the great pleasure of being a school board member for a private school, for a charter school, and I'm now on a statewide education board. And I've been at the Heritage Foundation twice, both times doing education research. So it's a fascinating topic, especially these days with what everyone is talking about coming out of the pandemic and really what all parents have learned about the importance of transmitting their values to their children and what happens during the school day that may or may not interfere with that.
Absolutely. And out of the great state of South Carolina, do you find huge disparities or differences in testing and education policies, city, county, state, between the South, the North, the West Coast? I'm thinking of all the regions that we break up the United States into. I know that's a broad question, but are there definite deficiencies in some areas?
Well, I mean, I think that the improvement in some states really doesn't fit the narrative, right? So the narrative is we need more money for education in order for students to score better. And the truth is that in places like New York City and Washington, D.C., they spend, upwards of $20,000, $25,000, even $30,000 per child, and yet the achievement in those areas is among the lowest in the country. And when you look at places like Florida and Arizona and Mississippi, you can see that the improvement over the last decade is actually remarkable in those states. And I think much of that has to be attributed to the way that the state leaders in those places have dealt with education policy broadly. And I'll give you an example. In Arizona and Florida, those two states have two of the largest and most expansive private education learning programs in the country. And in Arizona, they were the first state to adopt education savings accounts. Florida has education savings accounts and a private school scholarship program, as does Arizona, actually. And so when you look at particularly students from minority ethnicities, their achievement has really improved at remarkable rates, far outpacing the national average.
Yeah, it makes sense. Your book, we'll get into next segment, Splintered, Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth, but you also co-edited and wrote chapters in the Critical Classroom, also from Heritage Foundation. But then I scrolled through your bio here. You also co-edited and wrote chapters in the book, The Not So Great Society, obviously off of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, where you talk about problems created by what I would say, and you would say, the ever-expanding federal footprint in preschool and K through 12 and even higher education. To that notion that the federal footprint is getting wider and longer and traversing across the country, is there any way that we can prevent that? Not that you're calling in as an advocate, you're a research fellow, but could it mean different congressional members? Is that a method? A different president? Is it a policy agenda? Because it seems under Democrat sentinels, under commanders and chiefs that are Democrat, left-leaning, the federal largesse and bureaucracy grows even bigger. And you talked with Lars Larson about that yesterday, getting into, maybe we could do that here on the show, getting into the numbers. He and I are mind-boggled at some of the numbers, how big the federal Department of Education is, the billions of dollars, the small staff, and the minimal results.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, I think that the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, it now is more than 40 years old. It has over 4,000 employees, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,500 right now. And when you look at the amount of money that has been spent on education from the federal government, so you can call it easily $80 billion a year in K-12. Sizable portion of that goes to programs for children in low-income areas, and you realize that today reading and math scores are at historic lows. I mean, historic lows. Students are scoring today back what they were scoring in the 1990s in math and reading. And so if the purpose of the Department of Education, which their stated purpose when it was created was to help individuals in low-income areas, was to help students who were falling behind, they have utterly failed at that. And even as a researcher, right? I mean, we have to go where the evidence leads us, and I think the evidence is very clear that this cabinet level agency has not fulfilled its purpose, and it is, I think, well within the responsibility and capability of the next administration to dissolve this agency. I think you can move some of the offices to other parts of Washington. So, for example, the Department of Education has an Office of Civil Rights. That could be moved to the Department of Justice, and any duplicate responsibilities could be eliminated. And then you have the National Education Association, the National Center for Education Statistics, which handles student testing. That could be moved to the Census Bureau. But then there are other responsibilities that just need to be closed. I mean, Washington has become the primary lender for student loans, which is, shocking, right? I mean, that is not the job of a federal agency to loan money to students and put taxpayers on the hook, right, when students default. So those loans should be they should be combined, right? You need to eliminate a number of these programs, consolidate them, and then for some that may remain, such as Pell Grants, are one that come to mind. They can move to the Treasury.
Of course.
But we need to allow the private sector to become a part, once again, of the student loan market. Right
Absolutely.
now, Washington does 90% of loans.
I couldn't agree more. By the way, I was looking up here, FY 2023, the Department of Education federally, just under $270 billion, folks, distributed among its 10 subcomponents. And I mean, that's such lavish spending with such pathetic results. I looked up on usnews.com, best countries for education across the globe. I don't get it. It says the United States is number one, no change from rank in 2021 or two. Then the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, France, Switzerland. Why are we listed in so many? I looked up a couple sources while you were talking. They say U.S. is the best. Is that based on spending, wasteful spending? It can't be based on results.
I'm not sure what indicators they're using. I mean, it's fair to say that the United States offers access to education in a way that, outside of the Western world anyway, is pretty rare. I mean, I think in the West, countries like the U.S. and England and others, right, of what we would consider first world nations, we provide access, right, to everyone who is of school age. But just because they have access doesn't mean it's quality access, and that's the problem. You have taxpayers paying for a system that sends and requires students to attend a school based on their zip code. We still require that, even if that school has been failing students and producing mediocre results for generations. So I think when you look at how we compare on tests with other nations, the U.S. is below average on what is known as international indicators of academic achievement.
But for spending, we're by far, that's one of the measures in these surveys, we're by far much higher.
Yes, we are among the high, if not the highest. Yes.
Yeah, It sure looks like it. His name is Jonathan Butcher. You can go to the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org, to learn more about that organization. He is a research fellow in education policy. And we're going to come back. We're going to talk about why he authored Splintered, Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth, and also helped on The Critical Classroom, another book. We'll get into curriculums across America and why there's a push for critical race theory, which many of us disagree with. Stay with us. Jonathan Butcher stays with us here on the Tom Anderson Show. Good morning.
This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
We are back. Jonathan Butcher, Senior Fellow, highlighting education policy. He's a wonk there at Heritage Foundation. I say wonk endearingly because he's written books that have most recently touched on critical race theory. And Jonathan, what was the impetus or the prod that pushed you into writing those? Do you think it's a problem that's growing in America?
Well, most certainly. I mean, the myth is that critical race theory is not taught in schools today. And when you realize that critical race theory is, by its very nature, racially discriminatory. I mean, it advocates for racial discrimination. And when you look at what the founders, such as Richard Delgado and Derek Bell and others, said about their theory, they said that white individuals only allowed civil rights to progress in the United States to preserve their power, which is a shockingly cynical take on American history. And I think the present-day expositor of critical race theory, those like Ibram Kendi, he's famous for saying that discrimination today is necessary because of past discrimination, and future discrimination will be necessary because of present discrimination. So, it's not just some philosophy that conservatives are picking on. I mean, this is a racially prejudiced and biased worldview. And yet it is taught in K-12 schools around the country. I mean, and so when I wrote my books, Splintered, Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth, I put specific examples of textbooks, of instructional lessons, of memos to school communities, and on, that say that ideas such as intersectionality, critical race theory by name, they often call it cultural competency, are all used in K-12 classrooms around the country. And so I wanted to make the point that this is something that divides culture, right? It divides communities. It does not give us a shared sense of national identity.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I've talked to people about African-American friends where they say, I think it's important that it be known to students in America that our founding fathers, many of them had slaves, or Thomas Jefferson fiddled around with a slave and had kids. And I said, well, if that's how you feel, you're probably a Democrat. What about Martin Luther King's philandering? What about JFK's debauchery and drug addiction? I mean, how far do we break? I know that that's one element of critical race theory that's much broader, and the dilemma and the problem is much broader in terms of the dialogue on this. But little examples like that, how far do you change a textbook, Jonathan? That's what concerns me. From the base historical facts, that this was the president, these were the laws he legislated. Okay, maybe he had a fake wooden tooth, a chopped down cherry tree, whatever, but I mean, how far do you get into their personal life? It reminds me of like Wikipedia, where you look up someone's Wikipedia page and it's like, geez, why is that in there? Because someone else plastered that in on that person. So something negative or derogatory. That's how I look at critical race theory, where the changes being made are unnecessary for our kids to learn about, to me.
Sure, and are we going to judge individuals from history by the worst things that they ever did, or by the contribution that they made to the culture and the time in which they lived, right? I mean, I think that it's unfair to look at the past and use our present day perspective and suggest that they should have known better and done differently. I think they lived in the times in which they did, and they inherited, for example, with slavery, an institution that had been passed down for millennia, frankly, from the one time period to the next, from Rome and Greece and on and on, even in African nations and in African tribes, right? So it's not something that we can excuse, but it is something that we can say that it makes it all the more remarkable that we got rid of it, right? You had a nation that allowed people to vote for themselves and vote and choose their own representatives, design their own mission statement, design their own constitution, and they chose to recognize the value of the individual and say that the idea of slavery and the idea of freedom, liberty, and opportunity could not coexist. Like, it couldn't coexist, and so one of them had to go, and the one they chose to get rid of was slavery. And of course, it was a difficult process, and of course, there were failings and missteps along the way. But it is truly a marker for world history that we have had so much success by people of so many different races and ethnicities and countries of origin here in this nation. And I think that if we miss that story, and I think if all that we tell students is that our heritage is something that we should be ashamed of, you will be ripping a country apart at the seams.
In terms of state by state and your analysis, where do we see critical race theory taking most root? And there's a genesis, and then it starts burgeoning and growing, domino effect. Are there any states where you would caution and say, hey, Houston, we have a problem there in this specific state?
Well, I mean, you can point to the left coast, right? I mean, you've
Sure.
got California, Washington, Oregon, but there are, places in the Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then in the generally liberal New England states, right? New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, all pretty common there. I mean, I think, California they've rewritten their math standards so that it reflects, a battle against white supremacy. In Washington State, they have very similar model policies. So, I think there is a concerted effort here to reorient classes such as math and science towards social justice, right, or activism. And the same goes for history and civics and things like that. And, I think that you're taking away the skills and the opportunity to teach students how to be successful in school and in life, and replacing it with something that, has them only learning how to be ideologically driven in their daily lives.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned the left coast, but totally. I went to law school in Minnesota. My family's from there. Rural Minnesota's conservative, but the Twin Cities are not. You mentioned Wisconsin. You mentioned Washington State, where Lars Larson is from. Oregon, I don't know how he lives there. With California, very liberal and I think short-sighted and misguided in math and education curriculums for history. I agree. What about Alaska? Before we cut you loose, Jonathan, we've got Jonathan Butcher with us, who's a Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy from the Heritage Foundation. Anything good or bad when you observe Alaska's educational progress or lack thereof?
Well, one of the most important things that could be done is to make sure that students from ethnic minorities are getting quality reading instruction. There's a gap between white students, black students, Hispanic students, and particularly Native American and Alaskan Native students in Alaska. In fact, the gap between Alaskan Native students and white students is more than 20 points, almost 30 points.
I believe it.
You're talking... Yeah, that's several grade levels, and when you do
and
that...
think of rural Alaska. Alaska's 2.5 times the size of Texas. You can imagine if you've been up here, or if not, you can see the map. Think of rural Alaska, our indigenous, our Alaska natives in small villages. What teachers teach there? Very few. Are they the cream of the crop teachers? No. Just corralling all the kids to get to school and parents to be engaged, or foster parents. It's difficult, I can imagine.
Most certainly, and that's why I think some of these options, as we discussed in Florida and Arizona, would benefit students who are in hard-to-reach places. I mean, I think private schools and private learning options will appear. They will go to places when they know that parents can choose them. But when parents are simply assigned, to send their child to a local school, there's no reason for new learning, initiatives to become enterprises, right? So I think if you create the ability for parents to make choices, I think quality options will follow.
Yeah, I hope Governor Dunleavy, who's a longtime educator, came up here in the timber world and then became a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, school board member, then state senator, then the governor. He certainly has a legacy of education, so I think he's aware of this, and I know they follow you as well. So Jonathan Butcher, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. My friend, it's been a pleasure. We look forward to contact you again, maybe get an update at the end of the year.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's Jonathan Butcher right here on the Tom Anderson Show.